What is the problem with the 1962 Missal?
Well, there are those who simply say, oh, it's not that significant. The changes were not that significant. I mean, there are people who attend the 1962 liturgy as offered by a Pius X priest, SSPX priest, who might come to a Mass offered by a priest of our society, St. Pius V, and they might not even notice the difference.
Right.
But if they're not really paying attention, they wouldn't notice the difference. If they're accustomed to using the Missal and using the entire Missal for each Sunday Mass and weekday Mass, then they would notice a difference. If they were conversant with the changes of John the 23rd, they would see that there were some interesting things going on, especially if they went to an SSPX liturgy. They would say, okay, well, they're using some of the changes of John the 23rd in 1962, but not other changes. And why is that? Why are they saying, yes, we're following the 1962 Missal, except when we don't? An example of that would be when it comes time for the administering of Holy Communion to the laity. If they were really following the John the 23rd changes, they wouldn't have the Confiteor prayed by the servers at that point, but they have the servers pray the Confiteor. At one point, I know someone asked one of the priests, if not Mostly Lefebvre himself, but at least one of the priests, well, why do you say you're following the 1962 Missal of John the 23rd, and yet you still retain the Confiteor before the priest administers Holy Communion to the people? And the answer was, well, the people would notice that, and they'd be alarmed if it wasn't prayed. It would disturb them. So we go ahead and have to pray that for them, to keep them calm. Of course, my question would be, then why do you deceive them into thinking you're using the John the 23rd changes when you will use some of the changes, but not all of them? So again, I mean, this gets back to the very ethos and pathos of the Society of St. Pius X. But in any case, there are changes in the 1962 Missal of John the 23rd. Changes to the calendar, feast days were changed, and so on. Even apart from the particular changes that were made, there is the reason given for these changes. And the reason given for these changes were all humanistic, all to accommodate human naturalistic frailties. So we realized that these reasons to change the liturgy are not Catholic reasons. So we didn't want to involve ourselves in any way with those early changes of John the 23rd, because when the modernists tell you this is the justification for making these changes, and you realize the justification established principles that are anti-Catholic, you just can't go along with it. So someone today might look at these early changes and say, well, they're not so bad, especially in light of the Novus Ordo. I mean, these things are rather tame. And then you realize, well, wait a minute. These things were all part of a process. They were all part of the same process of employing the same principles to arrive at the same end, and that's the Novus Ordo. These changes were just steps on the way to the Novus Ordo. Why would we take them? And when we do, if we did accept them, wouldn't we somehow be validating the principles that justified these changes that took us all the way to the Novus Ordo anyway? So we said we can't justify these evil non-Catholic principles by accepting these early changes that were made on the basis of those false ideas. That's what we said at the time, and that's what we still say too. People talk about the traditional Mass as a kind of a unitary thing. They talk about the Latin Mass, en gros, but they don't distinguish between the true traditional Roman Rite before the changes came in and the series of stages of the changes that led up to the new Mass, but it was still in Latin at the time, and they're making a mistake in not distinguishing that and just wanting to tap in at a certain point in the revolutionary process. Our position is go back before the revolutionary process began, go back before the modernists got their filthy mitts on the liturgy and did violence to it, and use the Catholic liturgy as it was before the modernists defiled it, or began their defilement. I mean, the particulars of the differences between the 1962 changes of John the 23rd and so on, those are readily available to anybody who wants to search for them.
Right.
So, I mean, one could go down the line, but I think it's important to realize it's the principles behind those changes that is really, those principles are deadly to divine worship.